Hey man, there's a moment that hits you quietly, not in anger, not in heartbreak, but in clarity. It's the moment you finally realize that most women don't care in the way you were taught to believe they would. Not about your struggle, not about your sacrifice, not about how much you gave when no one was watching. And once that realization settles in fully, something inside you shuts off, calmly, permanently. This realization doesn't come from one rejection or one breakup. It comes from a pattern. From watching effort go unnoticed, from seeing loyalty treated as optional, from realizing that what mattered deeply to you was often just background noise to her. And the shock isn't that she didn't care, it's that you cared for so long without questioning whether it was ever mutual. Most men are raised to believe that if they show consistency, protection, and emotional presence, it will be returned. That care creates care, but reality teaches a harsher lesson. Care is not reciprocated because it's given. It's reciprocated only when it aligns with desire, timing, and emotional convenience. Once you see this clearly, the illusion breaks. You stop romanticizing sacrifice. You stop believing that endurance earns appreciation. You realize that people don't value what costs you. They value what serves them. And that understanding strips away years of quiet resentment you didn't even know you were carrying. This is where most men feel anger at first. Not rage, but bitterness, a sense of being used, of being naive. But anger doesn't last long here, because something more powerful replaces it. Detachment. Not the cold kind, but the grounded kind that comes from no longer lying to yourself. You stop asking why she didn't care. You stop replaying conversations. You stop trying to understand her emotional logic, because the truth is simple and brutal. She cared when it felt good to care, and she stopped when it didn't. And that wasn't about you. It was about alignment that never truly existed. This is the turning point. When you realize women don't care the way you thought they did, you stop over-investing emotionally, not out of spite, but out of accuracy. You begin matching effort instead of leading with it, and that shift alone changes how you move through every interaction. Neither will you care the same way again. Not blindly, not endlessly, not at your own expense. You don't become heartless, you become selective. You reserve emotional energy for people who show consistency, accountability, and presence without being reminded. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop caring excessively, you become more attractive. Not because you're distant, but because you're no longer emotionally begging reality to be different. You're standing in it, calm, clear, unmoved. This is where freedom begins. Not freedom from women, but freedom from expectation, from the belief that care guarantees return, from the fantasy that emotional effort earns security. Once that belief dies, so does desperation, and in its place, something far more powerful forms, self-respect that no one can take away. When you finally accept that most women don't care the way you imagined, you stop negotiating with reality. You no longer try to earn empathy through patience or understanding. You realize that empathy isn't activated by endurance, it's activated by relevance. And once you see that, you stop exhausting yourself trying to be emotionally indispensable. This is where your inner dialogue changes. You stop asking, what could I have done differently? And start asking, why did I tolerate this for so long? That question doesn't create shame, it creates boundaries. And boundaries don't come from anger, they come from clarity. You also begin to notice how often your care was taken for granted, not maliciously, not consciously, but casually, like something assumed to be there, and when something is assumed, it's rarely valued. That realization stings, but it also wakes you up. Once awake, you stop volunteering emotional labor. You stop being the one who checks in, reassures, stabilizes, and absorbs uncertainty. Not because you can't, but because you finally understand the cost. And the cost was always you. This is where detachment stops being scary and starts being peaceful. You're no longer bracing yourself for disappointment. You're no longer hoping someone will suddenly see your worth. You already see it, and that internal recognition makes external validation unnecessary. Men fear this phase because they think it will make them cold. It doesn't. It makes them precise. You still feel attraction. You still feel interest, but you don't attach those feelings to expectation. You let them exist without turning them into obligation. You also stop confusing emotional expression with emotional investment. Just because someone talks, shares, or reacts doesn't mean they're committed. You learn to separate feeling from follow-through, and once you do, words lose their power to mislead you. This is where you begin matching energy naturally. If effort is mutual, you deepen. If it fades, you step back without explanation. No speeches, no ultimatums, just alignment or absence, and that simplicity feels almost shocking after years of emotional overextension. Neither will you care recklessly again, not because you're afraid, but because you've learned restraint is self-respect. You don't pour into uncertainty anymore. You don't invest in potential. You respond to what's real, present, and consistent. And this is the quiet power most men never reach. When you stop caring in excess, you don't lose connection, you lose illusion. You stop giving pieces of yourself to people who never asked for the responsibility. And in that moment, you don't feel empty, you feel free. At this point, you start recognizing how much of your past care was actually fear in disguise. Fear of losing connection, fear of being alone, fear that if you didn't give more, try harder, stay softer, you'd be replaced. Once that fear is exposed, it loses its grip. And when fear leaves, so does the impulse to overextend. You realize that caring too much never made you safer, it made you predictable. It made your presence easy to rely on and easier to ignore, not because you lacked value, but because value that's always available stops being protected. This is where your emotional posture shifts. You're no longer leaning forward, waiting to be reassured. You're standing upright, watching how people show up without interference. And people reveal far more when they think they're not being managed. You also stop translating disappointment into self-blame. When interest fades, you don't assume you failed. You assume alignment ended. That reframing alone removes the sting, because misalignment isn't rejection, it's information. Men often struggle here because they were taught that emotional endurance equals strength, but real strength is knowing when to withdraw attention without resentment, to step back without making it dramatic, to stop caring without becoming bitter. This is where emotional economy becomes instinctive. You don't give energy to what drains you. You don't invest in people who are unsure about you. You don't stay present where effort is one-sided, not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. You may notice something unexpected. Once you stop caring excessively, women often start noticing you more. Not because you're cold, but because your attention now has weight. It's no longer free-flowing, it's selective. But by now, that reaction doesn't control you. You're not adjusting your behavior to provoke interest. You're simply being accurate. If someone steps forward, you meet them. If they hesitate, you don't chase clarity, you move on. Neither will you care about being misunderstood anymore. If someone paints you as distant or changed, you let them. You've learned that clarity doesn't require consensus. The people meant to understand you will, without explanation. This is where your life gets quieter, in the best way. Fewer emotional spikes, less mental noise, less replaying of conversations. You're no longer living inside other people's perceptions, you're grounded in your own. And that grounding is where peace finally settles. This is the phase where you realize how much of your old emotional investment was performative, without you ever intending it to be. You weren't pretending, you were hoping that if you showed enough depth, patience, and understanding, it would be recognized as value. But recognition doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from leverage, and leverage only exists when you're willing to walk away. You also begin to understand that care without boundaries turns into emotional charity. You give and give, not because it's reciprocated, but because it feels aligned with who you believe you are. The problem is, charity creates imbalance, and imbalance slowly turns respect into expectation. Once that happens, your care no longer feels special, it feels assumed. At this point, your nervous system recalibrates. You stop bracing for disappointment, you stop anticipating emotional drops, you stop reading into tone, timing, and micro shifts. Your body finally realizes it doesn't need to stay on alert. And when the body relaxes, the mind follows. This is where you stop trying to be emotionally understood by people who never tried to understand you. You see clearly now. Understanding was never the barrier, interest was, and interest cannot be negotiated into existence through explanation. You also stop interpreting indifference as cruelty. You realize most people aren't malicious, they're simply self-focused. They care when it serves their emotional state, and they disengage when it doesn't. Once you accept that, resentment loses its fuel. Neither will you care to prove your worth anymore. You don't need to be seen as good, deep, or different. You know who you are. And that self-knowledge removes the urge to convince anyone else. Convincing is exhausting. Being is effortless. This is where your attention becomes deliberate. You don't offer it as reassurance. You don't use it to maintain connection. You give it when alignment is present, and you withdraw it cleanly when it's not. No bitterness, no punishment, just accuracy. You may notice that people react differently to you now. Some feel uneasy, others feel drawn. But either way, you're no longer managing their reactions, you're not shaping yourself to fit comfort, and that autonomy feels unfamiliar but freeing. This is also where emotional honesty becomes easier. Not because you share more, but because you attach less. You can express interest without fear. You can disengage without guilt. Your emotions are no longer bargaining chips, they're information. By this point, the shift is irreversible. You don't see relationships as places to be needed, you see them as spaces to be aligned, and once alignment becomes the requirement, caring becomes optional, conditional, and powerful, because now it's given by choice, not fear. Now you start noticing how silence inside you has replaced urgency. There's no pressure to fix things, clarify things, or rescue connections from falling apart. You understand that anything worth keeping doesn't require constant maintenance through anxiety. If it needs to be saved by force, it was already unstable. You also realize that caring less doesn't mean feeling less, it means filtering more. You still feel deeply, but you don't offer that depth to people who treat it casually. Your emotions aren't shut down, they're guarded by standards instead of hope. This is where you stop being emotionally reactive to disappointment. When someone pulls away, you don't spiral, you don't internalize it as failure. You recognize it as misalignment, revealing itself earlier than expected, and early clarity is a gift, not a loss. You may look back and see how often you tried to hold space for people who were never holding space for you, how often you stayed patient while they stayed uncertain. That imbalance doesn't anger you anymore, it educates you. Neither will you care to chase closure now. You don't need final conversations, perfect explanations, or emotional wrap-ups. Behavior already gave you the answer. Seeking verbal confirmation would only reopen doors you already closed internally. This is where your self-respect becomes quiet but immovable. You don't announce it, you don't defend it. You simply stop participating in dynamics that erode it, and that withdrawal is calm, not dramatic, because it's rooted in certainty. You also stop romanticizing emotional struggle. You no longer believe that intensity equals depth or that suffering proves commitment. You understand now that peace is the clearest signal of alignment, and anything that costs you your peace is too expensive. At this stage, even attraction feels different. You're not pulled toward people who need saving, fixing, or constant reassurance. You're drawn to those who are already steady, who don't need your emotional labor to function. People may tell you you've changed, and they're right, but not in the way they think. You didn't become colder, you became clearer. You stopped confusing availability with love and endurance with loyalty. And this is the final layer of the realization. When you accept that most women don't care the way you were taught to believe, you don't become bitter, you become free. Free to care where it's returned, free to walk away where it's not, and free to live without carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours. At this point, you stop confusing emotional availability with virtue. You realize that always being open, always being understanding, always being there didn't make you noble, it made you accessible without conditions. And anything accessible without conditions eventually loses perceived value, not because it lacks worth, but because it lacks consequence. You also recognize how often you minimized your own discomfort to preserve connection. How many times you told yourself, it's not that bad, or she's just going through something, while quietly absorbing disrespect, neglect, or inconsistency. That pattern ends here, not with anger, but with honesty toward yourself. This is where your emotional standards rise without becoming rigid. You're not demanding perfection, you're demanding reciprocity. You no longer tolerate situations where care flows in one direction and expectation flows in the other. Equality becomes non-negotiable, not because you need fairness, but because imbalance always turns into resentment. Neither will you care to be the emotional anchor for someone who hasn't anchored themselves. You understand now that stabilizing someone else's chaos costs you your own clarity, and clarity, once regained, is something you refuse to trade again. This is where the idea of earning love dissolves. You stop believing that if you're patient enough, supportive enough, forgiving enough, love will eventually arrive. Love doesn't arrive through endurance, it arrives through mutual readiness, and readiness can't be forced. You may notice that your empathy becomes sharper, not softer. You can still understand someone's pain, confusion, or fear, but you don't sacrifice yourself to accommodate it. Empathy without self-betrayal becomes your new baseline. At this stage, walking away feels clean. No speeches, no emotional residue, no internal arguments. You don't leave because you're hurt. You leave because you're aligned with yourself. And leaving from alignment feels peaceful, not dramatic. You also stop fearing being alone. Loneliness once pushed you to overcare, overgive, and overstay. Now solitude feels preferable to emotional imbalance, not because you dislike connection, but because you respect yourself too much to settle for half presence. People may sense this shift and respond unpredictably. Some will try to pull you back into old dynamics. Others will accuse you of changing. You don't argue, you don't explain. Growth doesn't require permission, and clarity doesn't require agreement. This is where everything settles. You care, but selectively. You engage, but consciously. You give, but only where it's returned. And in that balance, you finally understand the truth. When you stop caring blindly about those who never truly cared back, you don't lose love. You create the conditions for it to finally exist. Now you start seeing how much peace comes from no longer interpreting everything personally. When interest fades, plans change, or effort drops, you don't rush to assign meaning to it. You don't make it about your worth. You recognize it as someone revealing their capacity, and capacity has nothing to do with your value. You also realize how exhausting it was to constantly adjust yourself to maintain emotional equilibrium for someone else. You were smoothing edges, anticipating moods, softening truths. That kind of care drains you slowly, quietly, until one day you wake up tired without knowing why. That tiredness disappears when you stop carrying what was never yours. This is where your sense of fairness sharpens, not fairness as in keeping score, but fairness as in balance. You notice immediately when effort, respect, or curiosity flows only one way. And instead of negotiating balance into existence, you simply withdraw from imbalance. Neither will you care to rescue potential anymore. Potential once felt exciting because it allowed hope to replace reality, but hope without structure is just delay. You now value what is, not what could be, if. And that shift alone saves you years. You may find that your emotional reactions have slowed dramatically. Things that once triggered anxiety now barely register, not because you're numb, but because you're not invested in unstable ground. Emotional calm becomes your default, not something you have to fight for. This is also where your boundaries stop feeling like walls. They feel like filters. You're not blocking connection, you're directing it. Only those who meet your standard of consistency, accountability, and presence make it through. Everyone else fades naturally. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, stop preparing explanations, stop wondering how to say things the right way. The right people don't require perfect delivery. They respond to intention and action, not emotional gymnastics. At this stage, caring becomes intentional rather than reactive. You choose when to invest, when to listen deeply, when to open up. And because it's chosen, it feels empowering instead of draining. You're no longer pouring from an empty place. You also notice how differently people treat you when you're no longer trying to be understood. Some lean in, others drift away. Both outcomes feel fine. You're not here to be liked by everyone. You're here to live in alignment with yourself. And this is where the transformation completes another layer. When you finally accept that most women don't care the way you once believed, you stop expecting them to. You stop resenting them for it. You simply adjust your care to match reality. And that adjustment, quiet, grounded, and honest, is what restores your strength without hardening your heart. At this stage, you stop mistaking emotional effort for moral superiority. You no longer believe that caring more makes you better. It just makes you more exposed. And exposure without protection doesn't create intimacy. It creates vulnerability without safety. Once you understand that, you stop offering depth where structure is missing. You also begin to notice how much lighter your mind feels. There's no background noise of should I text, should I explain, should I try one more time. Decisions are faster because your standards are clearer, and clarity removes hesitation. This is where your self-trust finally solidifies. You trust yourself to recognize misalignment early. You trust yourself not to rationalize red flags into green lights, and that trust becomes more valuable than any reassurance someone else could give you. Neither will you care to be emotionally impressive anymore. You don't need to show depth, sensitivity, or understanding to prove your worth. The need to be seen as different disappears when you stop measuring yourself through someone else's perception. You also stop rescuing conversations that fall flat. If interest fades, you don't revive it. If energy drops, you don't compensate. You allow interactions to live or die on their own merit, and that neutrality protects your dignity without aggression. This is where emotional independence becomes unmistakable. You enjoy connection, but you don't depend on it. You welcome intimacy, but you don't cling to it. Your emotional state no longer rises and falls with someone else's attention. Men often think this level of detachment means they've lost something. In reality, they've regained themselves. They've reclaimed mental space, emotional energy, and time that was once spent managing uncertainty. You may notice that when you do care now, it's deeper but narrower. Fewer people have access, but those who do feel it fully, and because it's rare, it's respected. At this point, even disappointment feels different. It doesn't linger, it doesn't spiral. It registers, informs you, and passes. You don't carry it forward into new situations. Each connection stands on its own. This is the quiet strength most men never reach. You still care, but only where it's earned. You still feel, but without self-betrayal. And once you reach this place, you realize something undeniable. When you stop caring blindly about people who never truly cared back, you don't become colder, you become free. By now, you've stopped waiting for emotional permission to live your life. You don't pause your growth, your plans, or your momentum, hoping someone will finally show up the way you need them to. You move forward regardless, and that forward motion does something powerful. It makes your life feel complete with or without companionship. You also realize how often you once tolerated emotional inconsistency because you feared starting over. Starting over felt exhausting, but staying stuck was quietly draining you every day. Once you choose the clean break over the slow bleed, relief replaces fear almost immediately. This is where emotional maturity becomes non-negotiable for you. Not perfection, not flawlessness, but accountability, self-awareness, the ability to care without needing to be chased. If those traits aren't present, attraction doesn't deepen, it stalls. Neither will you care to decode mixed signals anymore. Mixed signals are now interpreted accurately. Uncertainty. And uncertainty is no longer something you try to fix. It's something you step away from. You don't argue with confusion, you exit it. At this level, your emotional reactions feel proportionate. You don't overreact to loss, and you don't over-celebrate attention. Everything feels balanced, grounded. You're no longer swinging between hope and disappointment because your expectations are aligned with reality. You may notice that people sense this immediately. There's less tolerance for games around you, less ambiguity, less testing. Not because you demand clarity, but because confusion doesn't survive, where attention isn't chasing it. This is also where your empathy becomes clean. You can understand someone's pain without absorbing it. You can listen without losing yourself. And that separation allows compassion without self-sacrifice, a balance you didn't know was possible before. Men often think caring less means becoming isolated. In reality, it refines connection. Fewer people get access, but the connections that remain feel stable, mutual, and real. Quality replaces quantity naturally. You also stop replaying the past, not because you suppress it, but because it no longer teaches you anything new. The lesson has already landed. You don't need to revisit it to feel justified. You've integrated it, and this is where peace becomes your baseline, not a temporary state. You're no longer emotionally negotiating with people who don't meet you halfway. You care, but selectively. You engage, but intentionally. And once you reach this place, you realize the truth most men never do. When you stop caring where it was never returned, you don't lose connection. You finally gain control over your own life. At this final stage, something settles so deeply that it no longer needs reinforcement. You don't remind yourself to care less. You simply don't overextend anymore. Your nervous system has learned a pattern. It knows what imbalance feels like, and it refuses to stay there. That instinct becomes your quiet guardian. You no longer confuse emotional distance with loss. Distance is now information. It tells you where energy naturally flows and where it doesn't. And instead of fighting that flow, you align with it. Alignment replaces effort, and effortlessness replaces anxiety. This is where your identity stops being relationally dependent. You're not defining yourself by who stays, who leaves, or who chooses you. Your sense of self exists independently of anyone else's feelings. That independence is not loneliness, it's sovereignty. You may notice that people respond differently to you now. Some feel calmer around you, others feel exposed. When you're no longer overgiving, you stop buffering discomfort for others. And without that buffer, people are forced to face their own emotional patterns. You also stop interpreting indifference as rejection. Indifference is simply neutrality. It doesn't wound you because it doesn't threaten your identity. You no longer need to be special to everyone. You only need to be aligned with yourself. This is where your emotional energy becomes directional. You invest it where growth is mutual. You withdraw it where stagnation appears. There's no resentment in that movement, only clarity. And clarity makes emotional decisions clean. Men often think this level of detachment kills romance. In reality, it saves it. Romance that survives without desperation, without fear, without self-betrayal is the only kind that lasts. Everything else was intensity, pretending to be depth. By now, you don't talk much about what you've learned. You don't warn. You don't preach. You simply live differently. And that difference is felt more than it's explained. People either rise to meet it or drift away quietly. You understand now that caring is not a moral obligation, it's a choice, a powerful one. And when chosen wisely, it nourishes instead of drains. You've learned to care without losing yourself, to connect without collapsing your boundaries. This is where the journey ends and begins again on new terms. When you finally realize women don't care the way you once believed, neither do you. Not recklessly, not blindly, not at your own expense. You care consciously, and in that consciousness, you reclaim peace, direction, and a life that no longer revolves around being chosen, only around being aligned.